about to do a bit of a deep dive into one of the hottest topics at COP27, being loss and damage. So first of all, what is loss and damage finance? Loss and damage, first of all, is a matter of climate justice. We all know that those who contribute the least to the problem, being SIDS and LDCs, we feel the most severe effects, struggle to recover, set themselves back years, even decades on their developmental path. The impacts of loss and damage include, as we have felt over the last years, increasing in number of recorded weather and climate hazards, rising sea levels, flooding, desertification, heat waves, bushfires, crop failures. This leads to loss in areas of agriculture, food production, human health, ecosystems, tourism, livelihood, critical infrastructure of countries, and economic development. So loss and damage finance. The finance that directly addresses the unavoidable climate change catastrophes that developing countries are particularly vulnerable to. These can be broken down into economic losses, such as the need to rebuild homes, roads, infrastructure, provide shelter, food and emergency response, as well as non-economic losses, which would be loss of culture and heritage, traditional knowledge, and health and well-being. Just recently, we would have seen from 2017 onwards, devastating hurricane seasons. Within the Caribbean, we have experienced over $10 billion in loss and damage. This is US dollars, not TT dollars, from 2017 until now. Pakistan, we saw that the flooding across there affected 30 million persons, 30 billion in loss and damage. And mind you, Pakistan contributes less than 1% to global emissions. Similar to SIDS, we contribute less than 1% to the problem as well. And we can look at home, Trinidad and Tobago. We haven't had a dry season in about 2 years. We went up to Paramin yesterday on a group trip, and the farmers had no seasoning to sell. I remember a couple years ago, 3 years ago, up to 5 years ago, from November to December, anywhere you drive on the highway, you would see pickup trucks full of sorrel. I'm sure you're not seeing that this year. So while that may be a minor inconvenience to us, the ones who consume it, we would have to consider, well, there are persons who base their whole livelihood around these seasonal crops. So what happens to them? So coming up to COP27, AOSIS had to define a position. This position is actually rooted in a road or a journey that started in December 1991, where Vanuatu, on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States, of which Trinidad and Tobago is a member, proposed a financial mechanism to deal with the consequences of sea level rise. Fast forward to 2013, more than 20 years later, developing countries finally succeeded in galvanizing support for an agreement to establish the Warsaw Implementation Mechanism under the UNFCCC to address loss and damage in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. Although since 2013, institutional arrangements have existed under the UNFCCC to address loss and damage, still the international coordinated response that was envisioned by the developing country parties had not been realized. This year, we were able to make our position clear, which was a new sub-agenda item on loss and damage funding arrangements under the agenda item 8 of COP27 and CMA4 that had to be adopted from the outset. Additionally, an agreement on the establishment of a loss and damage response fund. This was imperative. And lastly, maintain the Glasgow Dialogue as a separate expert-level workshop until the new loss and damage response fund is established. we go into the outcomes when it comes to loss and damage at COP27. Now this, it has to be mentioned that AOSIS, who we just heard from the chair and we just heard from the lead negotiator, they were absolutely instrumental in articulating a firm position to the G77 and China and lobbying the support of other parties and countries, absolutely necessary. Contentious discussions around the areas of who would access the fund, who should access the fund, who should contribute to the fund, though that dominated the conference. Continued AOSIS lobbying, a lot of peer pressure, some last-minute media interventions by way of compelling press releases and interviews. And at the 99th hour, many hours after the closing plenary was supposed to begin, we were able to strike a landmark decision, which was the establishment of the first ever loss and damage fund to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, as well as the agreement on a transitional committee to provide guidance on the operationalization of the fund. So what's next? Honestly, this is all, I guess, speculation at this point. We do have a step in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to do. So from now on, or until COP28 next year in Dubai, representatives from 24 countries will form the transitional committee to work together to discuss the operationalization of the fund. The first meeting of this committee is scheduled to take place before the end of March 2023. And some of the topics to be discussed and planned to be presented at COP28 for implementation or for adoption include the general function of the transitional committee, the eligibility of countries, so what warrants an emergency, what events will be considered as triggers, what is the status of the nation requesting funding, is it all developing or is it the most vulnerable developing? Access, barriers to actually receiving these funds will be something very important to the Caribbean moving forward. Allocations, how much can a nation access? We can't predict these life-changing events, these nation-changing events, these economy-changing events. So in the event that something does happen, how much can someone get? How much support can someone get? And, I mean, importantly as well, the financing and financial instruments. Who will contribute to the fund? The developed nations, private and public sector, innovative financing. Will developing nations also be invited to contribute? Also, what types of finance will be accessible at the time of these disasters? Will there be grants? Will there be loans? Will there be debt for loss and damage swaps? Will there be bonds? All of this is still to be determined, but we hope that between now and COP28, the Transitional Committee will do what needs to be done so that we can have adoption in 2023. That's it from me on loss and damage. Thank you.